Chinese, otherwise please stay in English. So welcome everyone to the last webinar of our language-based digital activism webinars, series of webinars. This webinar has been organized within the context of the last Circulation Civil Society Network project funded by the European Union. And this is our second week and our last digital activism webinar. We have Anna Belew from the Endangered Languages Project here today with us. And so thank you for joining us today, Anna. And I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elam, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you all today, or tonight, for those of you in Turkey. Let's see if I can get my screen shared here. And just so you know, this will be I'd like to keep this fairly informal. So please, if you have any questions or comments, drop them in the chat anytime, or at the end. I would love to have sort of a discussions time with all of you. So let's see, can everyone see that? It's working? Beautiful. All right. So today I'm happy to be here talking to you a little bit about the concept of digital gathering spaces for knowledge sharing in language activism and revitalization. And first off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molala, and many, many other nations and peoples who live and work and travel along the Columbia and Willamette River valleys here in Portland, Oregon. The language Chinook Wawa is still spoken here, and many of the indigenous peoples of Portland are still here and thriving. And a little bit about myself, just to let you know my positionality here. I work as the outreach coordinator at the Endangered Languages Project. I'm also an adjunct assistant professor of linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And by training, I'm a documentary linguist and a sociolinguist. I work, broadly speaking, in language activism. We'll talk about what that means in a moment here. But most of my work is in documentation, revitalization, and languages spoken in Cameroon, which is in Central Africa. I myself am not an indigenous person, and I don't have a heritage connection to any endangered or minoritized languages. As far as I know, everyone in my family for many generations has just been English. And I am aspiring or hopeful or currently an ally or an accomplice in language rights work. Gerald Roach has a nice blog post unpacking the distinctions between allies and accomplices and the politics of language revitalization work. There's a link in the slides. And if you see links in the slides which look interesting, I will share these so you can click through. So a little bit of background. I'm sure this is familiar to all of y'all already. But this is a dire time for the world's linguistic diversity. Today, there are roughly 7,000 languages currently spoken, and almost half of them, about 46% by our best calculations, are currently at risk of being silenced within a generation or two. And the reasons for this, I'm sure, again, familiar to everyone here. Myriad reasons, from overt suppression, economic and political dispossession and disenfranchisement, forced relocation, forced assimilation, neglect by states, social stigma, violence towards speakers, a million different reasons that all congregate in most cases to produce a language shift and language loss. And there is no way around it. The diversity of the world's languages is currently under more threat than it has been at any point in known human history. We don't know of any time ever where language loss has been happening at this kind of scope and pace. But it may be a dire time, but it's also a very hopeful time in language reclamation and revitalization. So Gabriela Perez Baez did a study in 2019 which presented an overview of language revitalization initiatives around the world. This was drawn from a really comprehensive survey of 245 revitalization programs. Of course, there are probably many, many revitalization initiatives which were not part of that survey, which is great news. And there are certainly language revitalization programs which have begun since 2019. And if you are working in language activism, language reclamation, anything in this sphere, ELP is currently continuing and expanding that survey. So we would love to hear from you about your work to get a better sense of the growth of language revitalization around the world. And if we look at the years that language revitalization programs started, it's so encouraging to see this steep upward trend, right? Prior to 1945, there were about 4% of known revitalization programs started long, long ago. But in every decade since the 1960s, the rates of language revitalization have steadily climbed. And you'll notice that in the 2000s, we see sort of an explosion of revitalization work. And if it looks like the survey post-2010 actually declines, don't worry, this data was collected in 2016, 2017, so that only represents about half of that decade. In all likelihood, the rates of starting language revitalization programs since 2010 are much, much higher than that. So we see this wonderful, solid upward trend in language revitalization efforts. And of course, in response to this global crisis of language loss, language activism is a really key and central part of this work. But this is a term that's often used without quite specifying exactly what we mean by language activism. People might think of this as more direct policy or political action, or things more focused on awareness or rights. However, in the discourses about language activism within the world of linguistics, there's historically been this sort of artificial divide that's talked about by Penfield, Flory, and Tucker in a 2009 talk. So there was this imagined binary between linguists, who are assumed to be generally external to the language community, academically trained, probably in linguistics or anthropology, and focused mostly on language documentation and description, right? Record keeping in a broad sense. And then language activists were kind of presented as mostly internal to the language community, generally not academically trained in linguistics or other disciplines, and more focused on language revitalization and maintenance rather than documentation and description. And if you're thinking that this sounds like a very artificial division, you're right, it is a very purely artificial division. And so nowadays, especially after Flory's theorization of language activism, we reconceptualize it not as this sort of limited range of non-academic, non-documentary, non-theoretical activities, right? It's not just about the active work of language revitalization. It's also the full continuum of activities leading to the conservation of a specific language and the sustaining of linguistic diversity in general. So if you have ever wondered if you are a language activist, if you're in this Zoom call, the answer is probably yes, you are somewhere on that continuum of activities to sustain linguistic diversity. And so a language activist, in Flory's definition, is a person who focuses energetic action towards preserving and promoting linguistic diversity and or supporting language rights. So the Laws Institute is certainly a collection of language activists by this definition. ELP is also a collection of language activists. And Titaka Keegan, a Maori scholar, has outlined his idea of the hardcore language activist in this really charming talk in 2019. He defines the hardcore language activist as selfish, right? Very concerned with their language and community and devoted to their goals, but generous with their time, their knowledge, their energy. Poor, usually there's not much money in language activism or language revitalization, so there may be financial limitations, but rich in language, culture, community connection, and so on. The hardcore language activist also comes from a perspective of doom and gloom, right? There is realistic understanding of the severe challenges faced by their language, but also hope, right? An optimism and a dedication to positive outcomes for the language. And the hardcore language activist is devoted to their children and grandchildren and all of the future generations of the community. They're fiercely passionate about language. And Dr. Keegan says behind every successful revitalization project is a hardcore language activist. And one line from Florey's definition of language activism that really sticks with me is that language activism is a process of looking out and around. And I'm going to come back to this notion again and again, because really it is an outward-looking process. And so if language activism, like we're saying, encompasses this whole continuum of action towards sustaining linguistic diversity, where does ELP's work fit in this continuum, and what kinds of gathering spaces have we generated to support this kind of language activism? All right, so I'll give you a little bit of background about the organization if you're not familiar with ELP. So in 2009, there was a NSF, or a National Science Foundation sponsored workshop called the Endangered Languages Information and Infrastructure Workshop. And this was a group of scholars getting together to devise guidelines and best practices for collecting and publishing information about language vitality. And that workshop led to the development of the Catalog of Endangered Languages, or the LCAT project. So in 2011, there began this really large-scale project to collect the most up-to-date information about the endangerment status, location, current documentation, and so on of every endangered language in the entire world, which currently we're sitting at about 3,400 languages that are included in the catalog. And in 2012, this is a very long story, but Google.org actually became involved in this project and brought on the First Peoples Cultural Council as another founding partner. The First Peoples Cultural Council is an Indigenous-owned organization in British Columbia that supports the revitalization of First Nations arts, culture, and languages. And so ELP officially launched in 2012. We are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. But Google.org was only briefly involved in the project. They're no longer a core partner. One person from Google's translation team does still sit on our governance council, but unfortunately, we do not have all that infinite Google money. And so in 2018, I came on as ELP's first full-time staffer. And this really gave us the capacity to start looking out and around and expanding our work beyond just the core website and the catalog. And in 2021, we started growing even more. We brought on Dr. Amanda Holmes as the Language Revitalization Associate and began an internship program for language champions from Indigenous communities around the world to start getting involved in this work and learning about this creation of digital resources and gathering spaces. And so our governance council leads this project. We have 11 members from universities and Indigenous organizations around the world. I'll go back to this slide if you're curious about who is on the governance council. And so the early iteration of ELP was really centered around the catalog, which is largely an academic data sharing project. And in addition to presenting the information in the catalog, it also featured a media sharing platform. So the catalog was meant to be a way to make existing research about language vitality accessible for free to anyone who might need it, right? Previously, if you wanted a large-scale database of information about language vitality, you either had to pay for it or hunt down a bunch of disparate sources in university libraries and personal notes and all that. So our role at first was sort of as an amalgamation of existing knowledge that we could then give for free to people who needed it. So this was really a knowledge sharing project in the broadest sense, but it was tilted towards sort of the academic and documentation side of the activism continuum. And so if we conceptualize it as a flow of information, it was kind of heavily weighted towards a one-way flow, right? People would come and receive information from the website. They could contribute back to it, by uploading media, videos, recordings, documents, etc., about specific languages. And they could also contribute by suggesting updates to the information in the catalog. But the knowledge flow was tilted heavily in one direction. This was closer to Paulo Freire's banking model of education than a real interchange. But as time went on and ELP became more visible outside of academic spaces and in general endangered languages spaces, we started getting more and more requests from the public for more direct assistance and support in language activism. So just a sample email that we got from a user in Iran was, unfortunately, we don't have systematic education and no authority doesn't help or support our language. There's no printed texts. We want to preserve our language. Please help us if you can. Our dream is our community studying and teaching in schools and universities, and people write and read and talk our language in their life, right? So we would get more and more requests for more direct interchange and support for language activism and language revitalization. And while, yes, the kind of data in the catalog is useful along the whole spectrum of language activism, from documentation to revitalization to policy work, there are a lot of other needs in language activism, and the catalog is really only one way to meet those needs. It leaves a lot of gaps. So what are some of the other core needs for supporting language activism, especially online, right? Especially for a project like us who are purely internet-based and globally focused. A lot of language revitalization practitioners and language activists lack much of what they need to do this kind of work. So, for example, this work takes skills and training, right? Concrete capacity building, but there are a lot of geographic and financial barriers to that kind of training. Most countries have little to no infrastructure for training in language activism, revitalization, and documentation. And if they do, it probably costs money, which is not feasible for everybody. Also, you need knowledge. You need some information about child language development, about sociolinguistics, about recording devices, about media publication. But this kind of knowledge is often inaccessible, right? It could be written in academic jargon that's hard for normal people to understand. It could be behind a paywall. Some people might not know how to find that knowledge, so it's hard to get to it. There's a huge need for one-on-one or personal guidance and support, right? If you have questions and you're not able to find the answers on your own, it's really beneficial to have a person to talk to. But again, most people don't have access to that kind of personalized guidance in their work. And that leads to relationships, right? Having contacts with other language activists, other language revitalization practitioners is one of the most important supports in successful work, but there aren't that many spaces where you can find and build those relationships. And of course, it's really deeply helpful to hear stories and to hear the experiences of other people when they've walked a similar path, especially something as challenging and lonely as language revitalization. And again, there are wonderful places to hear stories of language work, but they mostly don't have a global scope and they're not always easy to find. And so when it comes to knowledge and capacity building and training, like I said, there are really different resources available in different parts of the world. So in people in, they call Kansas, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and many parts of the EU, there is accessible training in language revitalization and activism. So we have CoLang in the US, ALD, Breath of Life, and then there are university programs like the ones in SOAS, like the Laz Institute or NGOs. And a small, very small number of countries have reasonably good government or private funding for language work, but not many and not much. There is a huge dearth of financial resources in this work. And when it comes to support and guidance and relationships, some of us are lucky enough to get to go to physical gatherings for this type of work. So if you've ever been to the International Conference on Language Documentation and Conservation, there was a beautiful event called Ldtc in British Columbia in 2019. There are these physical gatherings, but again, it's hard to get to them if you're from some parts of the world. And the importance of them is encapsulated really well by Dr. Lorna Williams. In her 2019 keynote at Ldtc, she said, "Let us help each other. Gathering together lifted the spirits of the people so that they could continue doing the amazing, incredible, life-giving work that they're doing in their communities. We need to be able to share our knowledges, the ways we've created to save our languages." But again, if you are not from the global north, if you have financial limitations, if you have difficulties getting a visa, it's really hard to access those physical gatherings. And again, as Friederike Lübke points out, it was never an option for most scholars and activists from the global south to be present at events like ICLDC or ALD. And people engaged in language revitalization in different parts of the world, and especially outside, again, those hubs of revitalization like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, people often feel like they're working in isolation, right? We hear a lot from language activists in the global south who say things like, "I think I'm the only person in my entire city or province that cares about our language. No one around me gets it. No one around me is interested. I feel so lonely doing this work." And language activism and language revitalization is challenging on so many levels. It takes long-term dedication. It's very demanding. And so loneliness, isolation, and burnout are really serious issues, especially if you're not physically able to gather with like-minded folks. But luckily, as Dr. Monnieu says, in 2022, we can connect internationally. We don't have to suffer in isolation. We can learn from each other. We can support each other, right? There is a wealth of opportunities to build relationships across borders in ways that there weren't 10 or 20 or maybe even 5 years ago. And in the history of language activism and revitalization, some of the really great success stories have come directly from collaboration across borders, from sharing ideas and methods between communities. So if we take the wildly successful model of the Kohangareo, the language nest, it originated in Aotearoa with Maori language nests, the Kohangareo. It pretty quickly spread to Hawaii to become the Punanaleo language nests. And from there, it sort of spread like wildfire all over the world, right? To North America, to Europe, to other parts of the world, to Australia. And I anticipate that language nests will keep popping up all over the world, especially during the decade of Indigenous languages. And so this kind of cross-fertilization is one of the key methods for successful language revitalization work. And actually, Dr. Lorna Williams talks about her earliest work in language revitalization back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. She says, "That's what we were all doing, trying to search and help each other. We knew what we needed couldn't be done alone. People around the world shared what they learned. The Maori shared about language nests, the Sami shared what they were doing with language on the land, and we'd take these ideas home and try them out." Dr. Larry Kimura actually talks directly about the birth of Punanaleo. In the 1980s, he was talking with a Kohangareo teacher, and the teacher said, "You guys got to do something like this. If you speak to children in your language, they'll speak back to you." And Tamari Ridi gave that talk in December. By January, we'd formed Aha Punanaleo. So this kind of sharing of ideas can have immediate and really successful results. Aha Punanaleo is one of the great success stories of language revitalization worldwide. And Dr. Christine Sims from Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico describes a similar process. So in the 1990s, we were learning from the Maori people, from the Hawaiian people, and by 1996, people in my Pueblo and others were beginning our language immersion programs. But again, there are limitations to this kind of really incredible, really sustaining sharing of knowledge, right? This was mostly limited to people who could physically travel and gather across borders. So again, folks in the global north, Canada, Australia, Aotearoa, the US, Europe, and people at the margins of language revitalization movements, like Friederike Lübke has described African language contexts, they often have trouble participating in these gatherings because of mobility problems. And so if we look out and look around, how can more people in more places be invited into this tradition of knowledge sharing? Yay, it's exactly what we are all doing right now. I am speaking to you from another continent. This is miraculous. This is what happens. And so the ELP website was initially kind of conceived as a place where people could do knowledge sharing. So in a limited way, info about language vitality, info about language endangerment, media resources, but again, that's not enough. That won't meet the needs. And so our first foray into sort of expanding as we looked out and looked around was this gathering space in the form of language documentation webinars, which I believe is actually how I first met the folks at the Laws Institute. So that was another wonderful benefit of these webinars. In 2019, we partnered with the Language Documentation Training Center in Honolulu to offer free online training workshops in language documentation. And we started out specifically in language documentation rather than revitalization for a few reasons. One, it's what Ldtc had a background in. And two, it's a little bit easier to offer general training in documentation, whereas revitalization work often needs to be more tailored to a specific context. So when you're doing something for folks around the world, documentation is an easier place to start. So the Ldtc model involves an 8-week in-person workshop series. Each week, there's a different topic in language documentation covered. So audio recording, sociolinguistics, dictionary building. There's, again, a focus on documentation, but with the eventual goal of language activism and revitalization. Each week, it was taught by a different graduate student in linguistics. And in the in-person model, each language expert, who is a speaker of an indigenous or under-resourced language, was paired with 1 or 2 mentors, and these were graduate students in language documentation. So they had that personal relationship built in. And the mentors assist the language experts in developing a small documentation project. So a little dictionary or a short film or a website about their language, whatever people are interested in. And at the end of each series, there is a big celebration. They would have a feast and presentation and party, and certificates would be awarded. So we had to modify this a little bit for the webinars. We would offer these online via Facebook Live once per week for 8 weeks. Yes, there are lots of issues with Facebook, but it's really widely used. It's very accessible to most people in most parts of the world. And in some places, they subsidize bandwidth costs, so it's the only way to get online for free. And Facebook Live allows you something like this Zoom webinar. So there are live broadcasts from the workshop leaders. Participants can have live chat in the discussion area, and then they can also post and talk to each other in the Facebook group asynchronously. Unfortunately, at the scope of the webinar, we couldn't have these one-on-one mentor pairings. As I'll tell you in a minute, we had hundreds of people for the first workshop and only a dozen or so mentors. And now there are several thousand people in the group, so we couldn't do these personal pairings. So instead, we had to rely on group discussions and peer knowledge sharing in the Facebook group, which turned out to be a good thing, as I'll come back to. And at the end, we tried to replicate the big feast and celebration by having a Zoom party and having presentations from some of the participants at the end. And so the first iteration of the webinars had 445 registrations, which really exceeded our expectations. We had no idea it would be that big. And now there are 3,040 members in the Facebook group. We never dreamed there would be this much interest, but it shows you that there is a big need for this kind of free capacity building. And our participants are from all over. About 17% come from the US, 10% from the Philippines, another 10% from India. And then we have lots of folks from Lesotho, Canada, Mexico, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Bangladesh, Australia. But about a fourth of our members are from 84 other countries all over the world. So it's a really geographically diverse space. So our initial goals for the webinar were sort of basic skills and training in language documentation methods, sharing knowledge about global language shift and maintenance and what it means, why it's important, and also offering a limited degree of personal guidance and support from workshop leaders, right? We always encouraged folks, if they were having difficulties in their documentation work, if they had questions, to ask us directly in the group. But as we implemented the webinars, it really became obvious that there were equally or maybe more important components of these things, which was peer guidance and support, right? It was so important to see folks asking questions in the group, and before any of the workshop leaders could answer, they would get really thorough, helpful information from other participants. And that led to the building of a lot of really good, really supportive relationships between webinar participants. And so even today, you know, I see folks from different countries, different language areas, different backgrounds, still being friends and implementing collaborations between their language communities, which is beautiful to see. We also saw a lot of sharing of stories and experiences from other communities and other parts of the world. So especially during the live discussion in the webinars, folks would comment, you know, like, oh, we had this thing happen in our community and we addressed it this way and it worked very well. And someone from another country would chime in and say, oh, we tried this other thing and it also worked, right? So you would see this really wonderful exchange of stories that I hope has led to better language documentation experiences for those participants. I will go through this a little quickly. I don't want to go too much over time, but these are some of the things that the participants said about these webinars as a gathering space. So someone said, I'm not a formally trained linguist. I started working on language with a sheer will to save my native language, which is dying. But with no academic background, the challenge seemed like a dead end. Then I realized I just need people who are willing to teach me. So these webinars came as a savior to me in my learning crisis. Very flattering. This also turned out to be important for students and scholars who are interested in language documentation, but are working in places without very much training infrastructure. So I've been thinking of these webinars sort of as like a virtual conference or a virtual LDTC. So someone said the university I'm working at doesn't have a specific department of linguistics. The free trainings are so crucial to my understanding of my work, and the webinar allows me to engage with my peers and especially more experienced scholars. So this is not only sort of a grassroots interchange, but also a place for scholarly exchange for folks who are sort of shut out of the broader language documentation world academically. People also really appreciated the opportunity to get their peers interested in language documentation. Someone said, this was a pre-COVID comment, they said, the seminar is infectious. A lot of my friends got interested when I talk about it. They might have chosen a different word nowadays, but obviously it was the enthusiasm and excitement they felt in learning with other people was contagious. And a lot of people also mentioned that accessible and free learning was really important to them. So someone said it didn't require special equipment to follow. It was even possible to follow webinars on my phone when I didn't have access to a computer. Someone else said, I always wanted to work in language documentation, but I found the books difficult because they were very dry, but the webinars were the contrary. Not only were presentations highly involving, participants were also able to discuss their points of view. So again, that kind of peer interchange was really valuable to folks. And perhaps most important to most of the respondents was the ability to form relationships and exchange stories about their work. So someone said, this training has opened a possibility for the community together with researchers to come into an idea of language documentation. This is an open opportunity for the whole world language documentation activists to communicate intensively and share experiences. A really important comment to us was, I started watching the webinar and realized that there were people like me working with their communities. So non-specialists, people who aren't academically trained linguists, people who are just ordinary members of a language community with a desire to work for their languages. And another really meaningful comment to us was the passion and commitment to help researchers and enthusiasts was always visible. And it served as a boost to me whenever I encountered demoralizing challenges, internal and external. And as anyone working in language activism and language revitalization knows, there is no end to the demoralizing challenges you will encounter. And so to hear that there was a morale boost in this kind of digital gathering space was really important to us. And again, someone said, ELP gave me hope and made me feel important in my work, which is exactly the point of what we're trying to do here. Someone else noted, this community has been an amazing place to share and grow awareness about revitalization methods. And I really have appreciated the community that's been built here, enabling us access to information that likely would remain gatekept, right, for the people who need it. And again, that's ties to the original purpose of ELP, which was making accessible sort of inaccessible knowledge, but on a broader scale. This isn't just for scholars or researchers. This is for all language activists all around the world. And I think the quote that sums it up is, the supportive and collaborative space provided by these webinars has inspired and informed my work in ways I couldn't have done alone. And that's a really key takeaway. None of us can do this work alone. This has to be a collaborative process, whether it's within your own community, among your friends and colleagues, or with people around the world. And so these webinars sort of drove us at the launch of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages to host the Festival of Indigenous Languages. We wanted to do a 10-day event that would make this kind of feeling of community and mutual support accessible to folks around the world in a celebratory way to kick off this important decade. And so we featured talks from 19 language revitalization practitioners from 15 countries around the world, and each of them spoke on the theme of where we've been and where we're going. So retrospectives of their decades of work, the lessons they've learned, their goals and dreams for the future. We featured an online reception meant to sort of simulate that nice collegial atmosphere at conferences where you all get together and eat food and listen to music. And we also hosted several coffee chat sessions, which were just informal Zoom rooms where people could hang out, meet other language activists, talk about their languages and their work. These were pretty popular and folks asked that we host them regularly. So we're going to be doing this on a quarterly basis. Join us in May for the next coffee chat if you would like to meet other international language activists. So our goals for the festival, again, were to make learning about language revitalization accessible to all language activists, right? So we wanted it to be free, no financial barriers, online, no geographic barriers, no visa problems, none of that. We also really wanted it to be oriented towards non-specialists and grassroots practitioners, so no educational barriers. You don't need a PhD to get something from these talks. We also tried to limit the linguistic barriers, but this is tough. This was constrained by the cost of live interpreters. They're skilled people who should be paid well. So we were able to offer some talks in Spanish and French interpretation. And we also encourage speakers to give talks wholly or partially in their indigenous languages. So we actually, one of our governance council members, Emmanuel Guillaume, gave a talk entirely in Bassa, his own language, and that was interpreted live into English. So that was cool. One of the other goals of the festival, again, was for a venue to share stories and experiences from experienced activists as well as up-and-coming activists. And the goal was really to cultivate a sense of all of the possibilities in this work. There are a lot of paths that can be taken, and there are a lot of potential outcomes. And we have a strong sense that the more people hear about others' paths, the more they are aware of the possibilities, the more they're able to imagine what they want for their own language communities. And if you can't imagine it, you can't achieve it. So we want to sort of help people dream, help people ideate, right? And finally, we wanted to provide a space for building relationships among language activists and revitalizationists and their allies and accomplices. One of the most valuable things you'd probably find if you went to a language revitalization conference is the friendships you come away with. I think we've all met that person at the coffee table that's just awesome and their ideas are so valuable and we stay in touch forever, right? We wanted that to be possible for folks who can't physically go to these gatherings. So again, a few thoughts from the festival attendees. One Irish language activist said, the speakers showed the great advantage of this festival, the wide range of contexts behind it. She also said, I learned a lot from today's events. Thanks for this opportunity to hear people from all over speak boldly about their connection to Indigenous languages and the work they're doing. Actually, she wrote this in Irish on Twitter, which was pretty awesome. Someone else noted, it was great to bring together such a wide diversity of people from places around the globe who would otherwise not likely find themselves together. One attendee from an Indigenous community in the US said, I felt like there was a path forward for revitalization, which was wonderful to hear. Someone in Spain especially enjoyed the coffee chat sessions as a chance to meet so many people with incredible experiences. One Mi'kmaq teacher in Canada noted that one speaker's description of her methods for immersion sounded amazing, exactly what I need. I'll be cruising YouTube tonight learning the strategies they spoke about. So here was a really direct example of capacity building through learning about a method. And then sort of on the emotional side, she noted the last presenter was a Pueblo woman named Dr. Christine Sims, and I feel as though she's healed me a bit. She's the auntie I didn't know I needed, right? So that moral support aspect is super important. And again, she said essentially our goal for the whole festival. She said, it felt good to know that we're not alone and that there are languages all over the world in our same boat. After today, I feel a little lighter. And so again, if the role of this gathering space was not only to impart skills and knowledge and tools for the actual work of language activism and revitalization, it's also just to ease that sense of isolation and to help people find strength in solidarity with others around the world. And finally, I want to briefly talk about one more gathering space we're working on. This is called the Language Revitalization Help Desk. So the goal here is to sort of take what we've learned from the documentation webinars and the festival and expand it to a large degree. So this will be a place for folks to find relationships, skills, and knowledge, hear stories of other people's language work, and ask experienced revitalization practitioners for support and ideas and guidance. And we would really invite you to be part of this. At this point, we would love to hear from you about your own language work. We're working on a series of interviews and blog posts called Language Stories. We have interviewed some awesome people. You will be in good company if you would like to speak with our Language Revitalization Associate, Amanda Holmes. You can reach out to her. And we also invite you to share about your work as part of the Global Language Revitalization Directory. So this is going to be a massive directory of folks working in all parts of language reclamation, revitalization, activism. And the goal is to show not only the diversity and widespread of revitalization programs around the world, but as the international decade goes on, we want to show the growth of language revitalization programs. So we're really excited to help people see how fast this work is growing and the successes people are having. And also as a place to connect with each other, right? If, let's say, you want to start a language nest and you would like to speak with other language nest practitioners, go to the directory, look at all the language nests, reach out to folks in similar contexts and exchange ideas. And so ELP, I think since we have started looking out and looking around, our goal is not to be that one-way flow of information where you just come and find data and take it, right? That's not what we want to be. That's not our goal. We want this to be a gathering place for cross-pollination, for people to share all of the things that are inspiring them and encouraging them and helping them and supporting them in their own language work. So that's where we're hoping to go during the International Decade, and we invite you to be part of that. And if we have some time for discussion, I would love to hear from all of y'all. What kind of digital gathering spaces that you find really valuable in your work now? What you do there, what you get from them, and also what kind of digital gathering spaces you wish you had access to. If you had some place to go and talk to other language activists, what would you want it to be like? What would you want to get from it? And have you met anybody through online gathering spaces in language activism that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have encountered and that has been really helpful or fun or great to talk to? So again, thank you everyone for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to y'all, and I can't wait to have some discussion and questions. And please reach out anytime if you have questions or want to chat or anything else.
So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand. Or comments. Better.
I see a hand,
yes.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah, okay, perfect. I just wanted to first say, thank you so much. Amazing talk, really interesting to see, all the things that have been done within these gathering spaces. And as far as your last question is concerned, have you met any folks, you wouldn't have otherwise met? I have, so in terms of that, obviously, places like Twitter especially are really, really good in terms of utilizing that sort of connections. I have a question that might be very relevant, especially for people who will listen to this later on, right? So we have reached out to a few linguistics student associations within Turkey. And we've recently heard back from them saying like, oh, we have actually quite a few students who are interested in this sort of work, right? So they would like to get in touch with you and hear a bit more from you. And I was just thinking, a field like language documentation and advocacy, it can be very daunting to get into, especially after talking about, there's a learning curve sometimes. It can be very exhausting, all that stuff. So it can be very daunting when we introduce this to them. So I would like to ask you, how would you go about that, right? Like, how would you sort of recruit people in that sense? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. How do we indoctrinate the young students? So, yeah, I think you're right that it can be really intimidating to get into this field because at the core, it's a field that's about righting really profound wrongs and addressing really profound causes of suffering, right? It's a hard thing to work in, but I think it's important that students know that it's also profoundly satisfying and meaningful. I think if we want to draw people into this field, they don't have to look any further than, this is the kind of need for a gathering space, because when I think of like my experiences at ICLDC, I think about this profound sense of excitement and hope and joy and solidarity that you feel when language activists get together. And there's nothing like it, right? If you have been in language activist spaces, it's a special group of people. And I think that's something that those students should know, is that they will meet people who are deeply dedicated, who really care about others, who love their communities, who are curious and knowledgeable and interesting. And especially for folks who are coming from a personal background of endangered or minoritized or indigenous languages, there's a lot there I can't speak to as a settler without that personal connection, but the healing that people talk about is also important for folks to know about. So even for students who are from a dominant language background, knowing that they can do the work to support that kind of community and personal wellness and healing, I think is really appealing to a lot of people for very good reasons. So yeah, tell them that it may be challenging, but it's also meaningful and awesome and fascinating. And important. And, you know, I don't use this word lightly. It's good. It's good to do this. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Anna.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll leave the floor to others.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
and it's
you.
good to actually see you after so many Twitter interactions.
You as well. I know.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if anybody else just has thoughts about your own experiences, I'd love to hear those as well. It doesn't have to be a targeted and incisive question. We can just talk story a little.
Actually, I attended to the language documentation training by ALP. That was about 2 or 3 years ago. I even have a certificate. So,
Yeah.
and I would like to say that we would very much like to participate in your program. And in fact, Ismail and I have attended some of your seminars voluntarily. And yes, we would like to really, really participate in that. And well, I feel that in terms of language documentation, we as native speakers, we really need to take things into our hands, because like if we leave it to the academics, then it's going to be too late for us, you know, just to like draw the attention of the Westerner academics into our languages and waiting them to come to our country and then do like language documentation. It's just going to be too long. So, I mean, you already answered the question, but, you know, is it really necessary to have a PhD to do like language documentation? Really, like, in fact, in many cases, it's even better that people find you closer to themselves so that you compile information from them. Like, especially women, you know, like a woman in Turkey, like in the last community, older people really, they would never speak to a stranger. I mean, they would only speak to a woman. For example, it was like about, let me see, about 15 years ago, I did these like, I've compiled some songs. So I went to a village in my mother town, and there was this lady, and this lady was an active party goer when she was younger, but last party. So she knew all these songs in Laz language, and obviously songs are very good way of compiling the language. And I mean, she knew me since I was a child, but because it's a sin, she wouldn't let me record her voice. So she got her daughters to like sing all these songs to me, and I just compiled them. Otherwise, you would never be able to get all these things, all these songs from her. No way. And also, people really, really like that you appreciate the language they speak to you. For example, my grandmother knew that like we liked compiling words and stories from her, etc. So she would actually make a list of all these words and stories for my next visit to her. So really, I mean, they're just thinking, look, somebody really appreciates my language, and maybe for the first time, these people think that the language that I speak is valued. So, I mean, they really, really return back to you on that, because like they really come to you and they say, do you know this word? Do you know this story? Etc. And then they actually say, you should go to this person. She knows everything, like, so, at the end of the day, yes, I mean, actually, it was last week, wasn't it? We had this type of conversation as well regarding language documentation. I mean, we did discuss that, like, if you have a mobile phone, smartphone in your hands, then that's what you need. It's not like the olden days. I mean, you just go, you just like record voices, just record like videotape them, whatever. So yes, like you don't really need to be an academic or PhD holder, just do it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's exactly right. And what you said about people wanting to feel valued and feeling seen when you do language documentation is so, so important, especially in places where like foreignness carries some prestige or importance. We had a colleague who was saying, you know, he'd been working for decades on language activism. And he was like, yeah, my kids don't think this is that important. They always kind of make fun of me, always stuck here with my weird books. But he participated in one of our online workshops. And he was saying to his kids, like, not now, I'm busy talking with all the professors from the US and Australia. And they were like, oh, wow, maybe dad's work is important if all these people internationally are talking to him about it. And so that kind of like feeling seen from different parts of the world can be really meaningful to some folks in some contexts. Yeah. And so that's another wonderful part of gatherings like these is people really take it to heart that their work matters, not just locally, but internationally, which is really powerful for motivation.
There's a social media, I mean, there's a Facebook page that I've opened about 7 years ago. And, you know, like it wasn't very popular, but nowadays it's very popular because people see all these activities going on, all these webinars and, you know, like articles written, etc. I mean, they just started thinking, my language is not that unpopular. So now they started competing with each other in terms of writing all these words. I mean, how do you say this in Laos? How do you? So do you know this word, or do you know this phrase, etc. And they really go into competition with each other. And then in fact they share things, and like they even record things now. So it's great, like people found a different life now, like for the first time they started thinking, look, I know this language. And it's cool, it's for the first time it's cool to speak plus maybe.
Yeah, there's no underestimating the importance of that cool factor, It's huge, especially for young folks in language maintenance. So I love to hear that people are having like Laz knowledge competitions. That's so cool. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, I would be delighted to chat with you. And if not, again, please email me anytime. I would be happy to hear from you. I'm just going to drop my email in the chat box here. It's pretty easy to remember. It's just anna@endangeredlanguages.com. And again, I will share those slides. If you saw any links that looked interesting, I'll send those around so you can click those links. And yeah. And I want to thank, how do you pronounce the acronym for this organization? Do y'all have like an agreed upon pronunciation? Is it TADNETer?
We just say TADNET.
TADNET?
Yeah.
Well, thank you to TADNET for inviting me. I really appreciate it. This was a wonderful opportunity to speak with y'all.
We appreciate your time as well, honestly. Anna, thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope we can all gather digitally somewhere in the future.
Let's hope so. I mean, for one, we will be sending some students your way, definitely. So, recruitment in progress. Absolutely. Perfect. Yeah, if we don't have any questions, shall we do the closing remarks? What do you think, Ayla?
Yeah, if people don't have any questions, then
Okay. Shall I go? Do you want to go?
Okay, so Anna, in that case, let's be in contact. And as the Laz Institute or the TADNET project, yes, we would very much like to be involved more in your project. And yeah, we would like to share more. And also, we would like to be in collaboration with you. So I don't know, Ismail, do you have you want to say anything?
Elbette biz Türkiye'de başlangıçta özellikle Lazca ile ilgili, kendi dilimizle ilgili çalışmalar yürütüyorduk. Ama günün birinde işte Tehlike altındaki diller projesiyle karşılaştık internette. Bunun Google'un bir projesi olduğunu anlamıştım başlangıçta. Çünkü Google'la ilgili bir bağlantısı vardı yanılmıyorsam. Google muydu? Bir Google galiba, öyle olması lazım. Ve oradan öğrendiğimiz pek çok şey oldu. Türkiye'de de birçok dil konuşuluyor. Çok sayıda dil tehlike altında. Türkçe ve Kürtçe hariç diyebiliriz. Geri kalan dillerin hepsi tehlike altında ve aslında bir araya gelmemizin, işte Anna Hanım'ın da belirttiği gibi birbirimizin hikayelerini dinlemenin faydalı olacağını düşünmeye başladık ve böyle bir proje geliştirdik. Siz de bu projeyi geliştirirken de sizden öğrendiğimiz, örnek aldığımız, en azından işin felsefesi, mantığı açısından pek çok şey oldu. Bundan dolayı ve sizinle tabii ki ilişkilendik, birlikte de yaptığımız işler oldu. Bundan dolayı ben size minnettarım, teşekkür ediyorum. Bu tip projelerin çoğalması ümidiyle diyelim. Ve sizin çalışmalarınızda yer almak, katılmak isteriz. Çok teşekkür ederiz.
Thank you.
Evet.
And yes, of course, ELP is very much looking forward to collaborating with the Laz Institute and TADNet.
Perfect. There we go. Okay, so that's some of your links.
Anna has just shared some links from the messages section. All right, everybody. In that case, if nobody has any questions, yes, İlhan Aslan says it was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, İlyas. And in that case, this is the end of our webinar. Thank you, Anna, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone who has participated in this webinar. This was the end of our webinars for this year. And next year, we'll have another digital activism webinar series. And we shall see you in our other activities, other webinars. So everybody have a good evening and you have a good day, Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
so much. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.